So Carter Burwell, always leave it to the Coen brothers to surprise us. I remember this time last year I was talking to you about Three Billboards and Wonderstruck, and you were just beginning to start work on what everybody thought was going to be their first foray into television with a limited series called The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. Come to find out, it was a motion picture. So, did you always know from the beginning it was going to be a complete film, or were you just as surprised as most of Hollywood?
Well, let me put it this way. I always knew that Joel and Ethan wanted it to be a complete film. And I think that there was some question how Netflix felt about that. But yes, Joel and Ethan always wanted it to be a film. And it was presented, the 6 stories were presented together to me in a screenplay, the length of a feature film screenplay. But it was Netflix, and we hadn't worked with them before, and we weren't sure exactly what it would turn out to be in the end. But that was certainly the way they looked at it.
Well, certainly, I mean, when you watch it all put together, you can see how well it works together as a film. So can you just talk a bit about how was your approach to this work different in the sense that it was these 6 short films collected into one, or, I mean, did you kind of approach it as you're scoring a consistent narrative feature?
Well, it wasn't really possible to score it as a narrative feature in the sense that because each of the stories are so different, there are no characters that overlap or storylines really. You couldn't do that. You couldn't. It's not as though there's a story arc where the music could establish some theme at the beginning and develop it, and then 2 hours later tie it together, because they are just so different in tone. I mean, I suppose that you could do that, but it would have been completely at odds with the actual structure of the film. So we did investigate for quite a while how the music could maybe tie it all together, that maybe there is some theme that is consistent through all of the stories, but it's orchestrated in a different way or something like that. So we tried all these, I tried all these different approaches to do that, because Joel and Ethan they really wanted it to be a feature, a single film, but with all the stories being individual, all the characters being individual, and after they shot it, the looks of each chapter being so individual, music was in a way the last resort to try to really string it together. But I couldn't, I tried, but I have to say I failed. I tried to find something that could appear musically in all 6 stories, but they are just by design so very different. I couldn't do it.
Well, they're so tonally different too. I guess we can take them film by film. Let's start with the titular one, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs with Tim Blake Nelson. I mean, it's basically like a musical comedy about about a violent gunslinger. Can you just talk a bit about doing that one?
Yeah, so that one, of all of them, that is the one that involves score the least, because it's about a singing cowboy a la Roy Rogers, who also actually is a gunslinger and shoots people, and that's the concept right there. So there's songs throughout. Whenever anything important happens, there's a song to accompany it. So in a different type of film, you might have had score in those situations, but for that one chapter, it's largely driven by songs. And my only really involvement was to write something that introduces the whole film prior to Buster, and then to write something that would take you from Buster's chapter into the next chapter. So I wrote a choral piece that plays the heavenly choir as he ascends to heaven, like all gunslingers do, and it takes you on into the next chapter. But that chapter of all of them is the one that's really driven by songs that I wasn't involved in.
Well, let's talk about the next one, Near Algodones. I got a little tongue-tied there with that title. That's the second with James Franco. Can you talk a bit about composing that segment?
Sure. So that one, each chapter has its own look. That first chapter is very much, sort of a Roy Rogers period in Westerns. And Near Algodones is one that looks more like maybe an Italian Western, like a spaghetti Western. The color palette and the emptiness, so just a sense of great emptiness around this character, is typical of that period. And so, you know, the score is also has a sense of emptiness. Most of the scores are orchestral in some way or semi-orchestral. This one is not at all. It's just slide guitar with some electronic treatments of the slide guitar. And so it's meant to be have that stripped down quality that some parts of the spaghetti Western tradition have, where you've just got one or two distinctive instruments that speak for a character. And it's like that.
And then from there, you go into Meal Ticket, which is in a lot of ways sort of the it's hard to call it the bleakest of because they're all sort of bleak.
I think it's fair.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from a stylistic standpoint, and I mean, it's very cold and very sad. Can you talk a bit about that one?
Yes, I mean, frankly, the word bleak came up quite a bit in my discussions with Joel and Ethan. Whenever we refer to that one, we would just basically say bleak, and then we move on because that really does say it. Yes, it's two characters who, as far as you can tell, spend every moment of every day together, but never speak to each other, traveling across the the frontier in the snow. It's a bleak physical situation, and then of course the actual story and drama is, if anything, even bleaker. But I liked what I've tried to do with that one is do two things. One, of course, speak of the bleakness, and there's a sort of fragility in the theme that's carried by harp and guitar and woodwinds. But there's also a quality where Harry Melling's character, he's reciting poetry and Shakespeare, things like this, to these people out in the frontier. And I like the idea that there's something noble, aspirational in what he's doing. It doesn't work out well for him in the end, but I wanted to play that, like bringing culture to the frontier, and I wanted there to be a bit of that quality in the music. So it's not just bleak; it's also something more. I think aspiration is what I was shooting for, but I kind of had to, force that into an otherwise extremely bleak story.
Right. Well, things lighten up a little bit, I guess, at least visually with the next one, All Gold Canyon with Tom Waits. Can you talk just a bit about that one?
Yes, that is, visually, it looks like a classic maybe 40s or 50s Western. This tremendously beautiful valley, and every shot there's a blue sky with puffy white clouds, in the background. And it's filled with nature. The premise of the story is that no man has ever seen this valley, not even the Native Americans. And then Tom Waits' character appears singing Mother Machree, this sappy old Irish tune, and then all the wildlife flee, and he proceeds about his business as a prospector. So I wrote a piece of music for the valley before he comes, and that's the first thing that you hear. So that is sort of, the idea is that's like North America before it's been despoiled, and then when he comes, while he's there, largely the score is playing off of the way he sings Mother Machree. He's working. That particular chapter is very process oriented. You see how a prospector digs and, decides where to dig, all this sort of thing. And he's either singing or I'm carrying the song for him until we get to some developments that he doesn't expect at the end. And then the tone of the thing quite changes. But that's more of a traditional Western. It's also in terms of the story arc. I think you could say it even has the closest thing to a happy ending of any of the stories.
To say the least. The longest one of the bunch, I believe, is the next one, The Girl Who Got Rattled with Zoe Kazan. Tell us a little bit about your approach to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if by minutes it's the longest, but it certainly has the most score. It is the most really like a traditional Western in that the music is there playing the hope and dreams of this wagon train heading for Oregon, and the Zoe and Bill Heck are sort of negotiating a relationship. They it's sort of almost like a business deal, but they do it so beautifully, and it's the language is beautiful, but the way they perform it also is like this very delicate dance, and the music tries to leave space for that, but also tries to give you reason to believe that it's all going to work out for these people. There is some hope, and the whole idea of a wagon train with oxen heading across the prairie is, by definition, it's all about hope. So that one is the most, I think, hopeful of the scores and stories. And the Western is kind of our American myth, right? Of the hope of this country and of this continent. And so that chapter, I think, speaks most to that tradition. Of course, it's Coen Brothers film, and that hope is undercut by hopelessness as well. But it's the closest, I think, to a traditional Western in its general outlook.
And that hope is definitely squashed in the very last segment, The Mortal Remains, which is interesting, I mean, because it's so contained in terms of, it takes place on this stagecoach, and for the most part. Can you just talk a bit about that one?
Well, so the way, I didn't even read that one until just before they left. They originally handed me, and I think the other actors, well, basically the 5 stories, and then we knew there was one more to come, but it hadn't been completed. And I think that the way Joel and Ethan explained it is that looking on all those 5 previous stories that they'd written over the course of decades, they saw that it's not an overt theme, but there is sort of a theme of, as Joel put it, non-accidental death. That's the one thing they have in common. They're all Westerns, sure, but there is this air of death that hangs over each of them. And so they felt that the last one maybe should just be overt about that. And it's just like death's a character right from the start. Maybe overt isn't the right word, because you don't really know the role of death in it, but that you do suspect, as you watch it, you suspect that, are these people alive or dead? The characters. And I tried to treat it that way. I tried to write it as a ghost story and keep you waiting for when the real truth of this mystery is revealed, when they get out of the stagecoach, and they'll have to face a fate. And the music, the first half that chapter is dense with dialogue. There's almost no room for any music in it. But the second half, there's essentially no dialogue. And that's why, in a way, it's one of my favorites, because I get to really tell that ending of the story with music.
Certainly the theme of non-accidental death has been in the Coen Brothers movies since the very beginning. You've done, I mean, your music has been such a huge part of their filmography from the very beginning. I think you've done all but one of their films. How has the relationship grown over the years and over these 17 films?
Well, we're all getting closer to non-accidental death. It really hasn't changed. Some people ask me that about this film, because it's been, I think this is number 17, someone told me. But it really hasn't changed that much. We know more about what we're doing, but in terms of the relationship, it's pretty similar to what it was. They don't like to analyze their films, really. So when we get together and we talk about it, we usually just throw out an adjective like bleak, and then we move on to the next one. And it's only if we really get stuck and we're having a real problem that we have to sit around and have an extended conversation. But usually they sort of hand it over to me. I show them what I think is the right sort of reading of the movie, what music can bring to it, maybe that isn't already there. And then they react to what I do. And that's basically the way the relationship works. I present them things, they either laugh or they pace, and if they pace, that means I have to go back to the drawing board and try again. Yeah.
Well, I guess, I mean, when you work with somebody for 30 plus years, not just you, but also everybody behind the camera, their movies is basically, they've been with them for a long time. So I guess there's not a lot of discussions you have to have left about movie making,
Well, I mean, that's true. Although, it's interesting, but it was pretty much like that at the beginning too. In the end, like I say, they prefer not to be analyzing. They prefer to be making, I guess would be one way of putting it, writing, shooting, editing. And it's really just when I've got music and we put it against picture, that's just always the proof of the pudding. We can talk as much as we want, but and they don't really like to talk about it. You just have to throw the music against the picture, and it's either working or it isn't.
You've gotten your first couple of Oscar nominations in the last 3 years, one for Carol, one for Three Billboards. What has that recognition meant for you?
Well, of course, it's wonderful. It's it's been particularly the nominations, which I haven't won an Academy Award, but the nominations, are voted on by the branch, the music branch. So that's really recognition by my peers, and I do appreciate that. I live, on the East Coast, so I'm not. I've never been that closely involved in, I guess you'd say, the industry, and I don't see that many composers, honestly. It's only really at these Academy functions that I got to actually run into people. I met that first nomination for Carol. I got to meet Ennio Morricone and Lalo Schifrin, people like this who I've listened to their music my entire life. But that was very exciting. That said, I do prefer living away from the business and living a non movie business life. I live in a little town at the end of Long Island, so I'm also perfectly happy to avoid it too. But it's nice. I'm not going to pretend it's not. It was really, and the Academy Awards were a lot of fun. So it's a gas.
Yeah, Carter Burwell, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking with you. Congratulations on the new film.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.